Willow. Special episode: Ariella's Infinite Carousel. The cold winds of November were already letting themselves be known, their sharp bite a prophecy for the month that hid just around the corner of Halloween. Fall had been a strange beast that year. People who passed me on the street during those days offered a weird brew of understanding and resentment. None could argue that I deserved this. Not since my arrival in Willow had I taken so much as a weekend off or a day to myself. If I wasn't hospitalized, I was behind the counter or in the kitchen. Even when wounded or distraught, I would toil over the cutting board chopping veggies or in front of the ovens watching bread rise. Few were the mornings that the Willow would not open. Sometimes circumstance demanded it open late, but seldom were the times when those doors would remain locked from dawn to dusk. Even when the world shut down, I would take orders and do deliveries. It was as much a matter of survival as it was one of pride, but I would not allow a day to go by without my cooking available to the people of Willow. A few weeks off to recalibrate and reassess wasn't too much to ask, and by all account, none held it against me. On that cool night, sitting in Willow Border Park, I had sensed something different. Perhaps, from the vantage of my bench, it looked like they were all looking down on me, but I felt a certain judgment. "When will you open back up?" I could imagine them all thinking. And in my mind, I would answer that I'll open when I know what I'm doing. The ones who broke my heart the most were the Pilvists. 2 of them walked by that night, their white robes blinding in the twilight. Each greeted me with their customary beatific smile, inquiring politely about my well-being. While I have no doubt of the sincerity of the Pilvists for mine and everyone else's health, I could smell the question on their breath. When will the Willow open back up? To most, it's a question of taste and convenience. Who can blame them for wanting some of the best sandwiches and coffee on the East Coast? To the Pilvists, however, it was a question of faith. They needed my croissants, pillowy and soft, to appease their goddess. It may have been my imagination playing tricks on me, but the cloud to whom they made these sacrifices did look a little darker this season. However, the village and the Pilvists had survived without the Willow for almost a full year before my arrival. They could do so again while I sorted myself out. I can't remember when I first saw them. The makeshift poster, photocopied signs which had been plastered on every surface in Willow for 4 weeks, had heralded the arrival. It was also in the nature of the air itself. There was something half electric and half festive about how the children would run around town. Residents had an easier smile, and several struggled to hide the skip in their step. These days had the aftertaste of the weeks before Christmas. It wasn't hard to understand, I thought. Montreal has fairs and festivals all summer long. We celebrate anything and everything in the big city. Jazz, poutine, tea and books, there's an event for everything. Not a weekend goes by without the whole island paralyzed by some concert, parade, or gala. Pride, metal and EDM, movies, all stepping over each other to block streets and monopolize venues. Not to mention that there's always some circus or carnival to be found. Willow, on the other hand, is bereft of such things. Oh, sure, there's the apple-picking jamboree at the various orchards on the outskirts. Every farm has its own variation of a harvest or spring celebration, but these are very local, closer to family events than city-stopping festivals. The fair had been on everyone's mind for a while now, but it didn't feel real to me until that moment in the park. I'd put my book down upon feeling the rumbling of the ground. Tractors and trucks are common occurrences here. This was something altogether different. A veritable parade of vehicles, some stolen from decades long gone, drove down Rue Principale. Their bright colors were dulled by the setting sun, but their cargo remained as eclectic and festive as one would hope. Papier-mâché sculptures of clowns and animals, hand-painted signs and posters, booths promising food, drinks, and prizes to the most skilled, all flashed through the street as villagers waved and smiled. The entire display lasted for less than 2 minutes. A dozen trucks, cars, and vans passing in front of me like a catalog of promised delights. I'd not thought of going to the fair, but a truck with the words funnel cake went by, pulling at my curiosity through my stomach. I returned to my book, pushing me another few hours into the night. I'd come to enjoy this ritual and embraced my role as one of the border park's more esoteric dwellers. I'm sure to some I was the reading lady or the reading witch. I'd be there from sundown until midnight, sometimes later, always reading. At first, it was history and books on witchcraft and magic. After a while, I started indulging in guilty pleasures, reading young adult fiction and romance. The one thing I simply could never get into was horror novels. Aquilo quenched that thirst already. On that night, I was set to read until sunrise. I'd gotten enraptured with an Anthony Bourdain biography I couldn't put down. It's only when I heard some screeching that I was pulled from the pages. Looking up to the trees, I saw one of the local albino bats flitting about while struggling with a large black bat. None of my other fellow weirdos were around, which made me realize how old the night had gotten. The cold wind that had risen at the passing of midnight was the last argument to convince me that I should retreat home. Aquilo Border Park is but a few corners from my cafe and apartment. No sooner had I stepped onto the sidewalk that I saw them. A little crowd of perhaps a dozen people loitering on the street in front of the Aquilo. Kids, I thought, perhaps excited by the arrival of the promised fair or out to make trouble. Chances were that I knew them. The usual suspects were always students, only a few years younger than I was at the time. I wouldn't brag that I had their respect. I'm not that naive. But they usually stayed clear of vandalizing the Aquilo or making too much noise around my place. "There you are!" a voice called out from the indolent crowd. While familiar, in the way lemon is a familiar taste to an orange, the voice was that of a stranger. They were all strangers, in fact, and Aquilo wasn't a place where one meets strangers often. This was a variety pack of people. They came in all sizes and colors, ranging from a 4-foot-tall woman covered in tattoos and too little clothes for the weather, to a man that would have hid Gulliver in his shadow with ease. Age was no barrier to acceptance in their club either. An old man who might as well have been cosplaying as a Victorian inventor looked to be pushing 70, while the woman calling out to me seemed no older than 18. She looked both out of place and right where she belonged. Tight jeans with a small leather jacket gave her a bit of an 80s vibe, too fashionable for Aquilo. At the same time, she ran down the sidewalk like someone who's lived her whole life on these streets. "How have you—" She stopped, dead in her tracks, mouth open in shock and her eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "I'm sorry." She stepped under a street lamp. "I thought you were someone else." I smiled, the old customer service reflex of trying to make guests feel comfortable. These are people from the fair, probably out for a walk in a new place, waiting to meet up with some friends. "No worries," I say, pulling out my keys and ready to walk up to my apartment. "Hey," the woman insisted, closing the distance and stepping between me and the stairs. "You wouldn't happen to know if the cafe is going to open up tonight? Only place open at this time is going to be La Cachette further down the street. Not as many pies and cookies, and their coffee tastes like mud, but they have decent beer on tap." I motioned my intent to climb up, but the woman wouldn't budge, putting her hand on the metal guardrail to block my path further. "Are you sure?" "Positive," I answer, my smile fading. "I own the place." The shock returned to her face with a vengeance. Her eyes became round, their dark irises surrounded by a halo of white. It was that look people got when they were slapped in the face with sudden grief. "Isn't Doris the owner?" she asked after composing herself. "Doris passed away 3 years ago," I explained, as compassionate as I could. Having never met Doris Dufour myself, I often struggle when discussing her death with others. While a blood relative, I'm one of those least familiar with my late great-grandaunt.
"Oh,"
the young woman replied, distraught.
"I'm sorry."
Turning to look at her companions, her discomfort spread to them like a communicable disease. Their mood, festive one moment, had become perturbed. Just as the group fell into a superficial mourning, the woman herself regained a shadow of her own smile, as if she had fed off their good cheer to replace her own.
"Sad news."
She met my eyes and reached a hand to touch my cheek.
"Would you mind opening the cafe for us? It's late, and I'm on vacation. Try La Cachette. It's better than I make it out to be."
Once more, I attempted to push through. Once more, I was rebuked.
"You're related to her,"
she said, insistent.
"Doris would have opened for us. She always did."
"I don't fall for that trick anymore. Can I please go home now?"
"Please."
This time, she begged.
"It's tradition. A ritual for us. We put up the fare, and then we come have coffee and cakes at Doris's. We'll make it worth your while. You wouldn't want to mess with ritual, would you?"
The young woman lifted her hand, adorned with an assortment of rings, and snapped her fingers. From behind me, the man in Victorian attire pulled out a roll of banknotes, a solid inch thick. It looked like a mix of American and Canadian denominations, tossed into a tight wad with abandon.
"I don't have any cakes or pastries ready,"
I explained, hypnotized by the money.
"It'll take a while for me to put together any food." "We'll wait."
The woman's smile widened, satisfied with her victory.
"All right, then."
I stepped through the group, shuffling through my keyring.
"For tradition."
"Great-grandniece?" the woman asked, bewildered. Opening the Aquilo for Ariella's crew was like allowing theater kids to run rampant in a candy store. No sooner had the chimes sung their song than they all swarmed my cafe as if they owned the place. Oscar, the old man, was quick to jump the counter and face down the coffee machine. Something about his fashion choice made him a perfect match for the steampunk monstrosity, and I admit being glad he'd be getting burnt and spat on in my stead. The giant took chairs from the tables, 2 at a time, tossing them to his companions to set aside. Meanwhile, 2 lithe individuals, who were both androgynous and identical, pushed tables together. Buzzing with loud and even raucous discourse, the Aquilo managed itself while I took care of the cooking. No time for croissants and other long recipes. This was all about sautéed chicken and veggies, chocolate chip cookies, and anything else I could manage within an hour or so. The young woman kept me company, introducing herself as Ariella, the operator of Ariella's Infinite Carousel.
"I'm as surprised as the next guy,"
I said, pulling off the flower-patterned oven mitts.
"I've never even met her." "You'd have adored her. Almost everyone did. So I'm told."
I remember clearly handing her a towering plate of cookies, a huge multi-tiered mountain with every stage a different flavor. Chocolate chip, double chocolate, oatmeal, all the hits were there. Looking at me from across that mountain, Ariella winked and said,
"You know that makes us family, don't you?"
I followed her into the dining room, letting her effortlessly carry the plate of cookies. She moved it to one hand, grabbing a mug of hot coffee from Oscar with the other.
"You're related to Doris?"
I might have allowed a little too much fear to slip through. Paranoia, you might call it, but somehow I feared she had a better claim to the Aquilo than I had. Remembering the long list of people who'd turned down the estate before it got to me, I could see the possibility.
"I'm her illegitimate daughter from a wild affair she once had,"
Ariella said with a wink.
"Seriously, though, Doris was my godmother."
The cookies were met with enthusiasm at first and wild acclaim once tasted. For such quick work, they received nothing but loud, boisterous praise, none of which I heard. Godmother? It never dawned on me that Doris might have a goddaughter. More bewildering was the conclusion to a chain of obvious clues this revelation unlocked. Who was close enough to my great-grandaunt to want her as the godmother of their child? Pulling on her sleeve to take her aside, I could almost smell that old bed I'd slept on through my first night in Aquillow. The attitude was there, and with some effort, I could see hints of her parents here and there.
Fig? Ariella Fig?
I said, sure yet unsure of my guess.
Olivia's daughter?
With her index finger, Ariella touched the tip of my nose, scratching the skin with her polished nail.
Hush,
she admonished.
Not too loud, or she'll hear you.
These words brought up an image of Olivia, sitting straight up in bed, clearing her ear with a pinky at the ethereal mention of her name. The mix of confusion and annoyance on her face, though imagined, was so out of character for her it had me almost in stitches. Or perhaps it was the exhaustion finally getting to me.
I had no idea the Figs had a daughter. Yeah, well...
Ariella sat cross-legged atop a table.
I don't think I'm their pride and joy. Let's say that my choice of lifestyle isn't exactly what they had in mind for their bouncing baby girl.
My head tilted as I served her with a mix of scowl and smile. I could imagine, with some effort, Henry Fig resisting a child that didn't fit the mold. Not today, of course. The same forces that made him such a quiet, contemplative man could at one time have made him uncompromising and inflexible. Olivia, however, my own Aquillow mom, had always been nothing but welcoming and warm. With only the knowledge that I was related to her dear friend Doris, she invited me into her home. The Olivia I knew would never turn her back on a daughter. Would she?
Don't give me that look, Miriam Dufour. You probably wouldn't blame them if you knew the whole story.
So it's not just about running away with the circus? I asked, taking a seat on a table of my own.
It's a fair. Don't let the rest of the crew hear you call it a circus.
She gave her friends a side glance, and following her eyes, I saw that the mountain of cookies was already nearly vanquished.
But you know how it is. Sometimes you make choices that don't sit well with your folks, and against your better judgment, you become those choices.
I shook my head, a little sad. No, I didn't know how it was. Sure, I'd made regrettable choices in my day. We all do. But we learn and move on, don't we? There was something melancholic about becoming these mistakes, and the way Ariella Fig smiled while admitting it.
I can't imagine what you'd have to do to alienate your parents that harshly. I mean, you seem like a decent young woman.
Ariella looked at me for a long, hard moment after I said those words. Her eyes were painting me in naive colors, and I felt the coats of it becoming heavier with every stroke. After a while, her eyes seemed to soften, like when a good cup of hot chocolate finally reaches the stomach and gives you that comforting burn from within.
Oh, I'm sure a relative of Doris Dufour can imagine all the scenarios she needs,
she said, jumping off the table. With steps as light as puff pastry, she crossed the space between us, leaning in to whisper in my ear.
You just don't want to try.
She pulled away instantly, walking backwards in that way only acrobats and gymnasts can. Tiptoeing in her boots with near magical ease, arms at her hips and broad smile on her face, Ariella looked on the verge of taking a bow. There was something fantastical about the young woman that night. The whole situation had a fey quality that transcended even Aquillow. Strange as the village is, it's grounded in the asphalt of its streets and fields of wheat that wrap around. This was different. The presence of Ariella and her infinite carousel in the cafe had changed the nature of the Aquillow. The cookies were a feast for gods and the conference of strangers a bacchanal of the bazaar. And in Ariella Fig's smile, I saw mischief both pure and deep. Thin ice over a rushing river, there was a fragile threat that she might crack underfoot at any moment. How long did I stay enthralled like this? Ariella had to bring her hand to her face, middle finger pressed against her thumb before snapping them like a thunderclap. Only then did I break from the trance.
Your oven is beeping,
she winked. Then she left me to my cooking and went to join her companions who greeted her with a cheer. They left before sunrise, A blessing, if you ask me. Being on vacation does not absolve one of the need for sleep, and in those days, I sought as much rest as possible. Ariella had left me with an invitation.
"Come to the Infinite Carousel," she offered. "The nights before Halloween are our best. You'll have an evening you'll never forget."
What a fine promise that was, and after a few weeks of near hibernation, there was a tantalizing edge to the offer, one only made more appetizing by the glint in her eye. At first, I had no intention of going to the traveling fair. Memorable evenings of excitement and thrills held no enticement for me. These little calls to adventure that Aquilo kept laying out in front of me, like a perfectly set table and pulled chair, were not as mouth-watering as they once were. All I wanted was to study my craft and better understand the magics of Doris Dufour, and maybe read another dozen more scandalous novels. As the day wore on, however, I would keep returning to the invitation and that pair of generic yellow tickets Ariella had put in my hands. After my shower, a little before noon, I saw them again on my dresser. Then, as I was preparing breakfast, a small stack of blueberry pancakes with some homemade raspberry coulis and fresh whipped cream, they had followed me onto the kitchen counter. Even as I strolled out of my apartment, enjoying the cool breeze and overcast days the likes only October can provide, they were tucked away in my purse. They would tempt me every time I pulled out my wallet to buy vegetables from the market or meat from the butcher. But it wasn't the fair that was calling me through these tickets. Oh, I'd considered getting Annabelle so the two of us could make an evening of it. We hadn't had a night out since she and Eric had moved in together, and there was no telling what shenanigans we could have gotten up to at a proper fair. After all, did I not see a sign for funnel cakes? Instead, it was Fig's Orchard that called my name. Let me tell you, it's quite the walk from the middle of Aquilo all the way to the orchards. Somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour. That's plenty of time to decide that it is not my place to meddle in the affairs of friends. Carrying groceries that would have been far happier in my refrigerator than in a bag, I exited the village proper. The trick about going to Fig's Orchard is the very moment you can't see Aquilo behind you is when you can see the roof of their warehouse ahead. It's the perfect place for a helping of second-guessing, but curiosity held fast.
"Darling,"
Olivia said as she opened the door,
"I was already so convinced you'd come around that I damn near set a place for you at the table."
The grocery bag, filled with everything a girl needs to make a killer stroganoff, weighed heavy on my shoulders. Enough to feed a small army, or, in my case, keep in freezer bags for later that week. There must have been 3 kilos of food in there. It was all my arm could do to remain in its socket.
"You were expecting me? Why?"
She stepped out of the way, letting me into the house. Not much ever changed in the Fig home. Much like their cider recipe, it was a thing fine-tuned over the decades to become exactly what Olivia and Henry agreed they wanted. Old, beat-up furniture covered in throws and appliances from another era. The only concessions to the present were found in the kitchen.
"You take me for a fool? I know you're here for the meddling. You're a damn Dufour from the tip of your toes to the end of your hair."
"The meddling," I snorted, hauling my bag onto the kitchen counter.
"You make it sound like some sort of sporting event."
"Mm-hmm," Olivia answered, going through my bags, taking any perishables and putting them in her refrigerator.
"And you Dufour women are gold medalists."
"Actually," I started, taking the liberty to fill up the electric kettle, "I'm just hurt you never told me you had a daughter." Olivia Fig is skilled in many things. She and her husband make small batch cider that is growing in popularity around the region. She grows apples that are prized at the local market. On top of all that, she's a savvy businesswoman with a keen understanding of sales and production. All of that pales in comparison to her mastery of the withering glance. It's difficult to imagine a child going astray of a mother capable of a death stare half as potent as Olivia's.
"It's a matter of debate between Henry and I if we even have a daughter at all."
Then again, stifling authority is an invitation to rebellion, isn't it? Especially in teenagers.
Ouch, that's harsh.
Satisfied that anything that might go bad had been put away, Olivia turned her attention to the tea. The Figs weren't big tea drinkers when I first arrived in Aquilo. Henry wouldn't touch the stuff, while his wife only enjoyed a cup on Sundays while reading, her version of the Sabbath. Since then, both have developed an affinity for it. I'd like to take credit, having frequently offered Olivia the teas and tisanes I keep at the cafe. Truth is, her own travels exposed her to far more variety than I ever could. It was only a matter of time before Henry tried a few himself and settled on a favorite. She mused, pouring steaming water into cups.
My Henry's not one for ambiguity. Half measures aren't his thing. It's far easier for him to accept he never had a daughter than it is to live with what she's become. Butterscotch chai?
I nodded my approval. Back then, every time my nose was teased with the sweet smell of a particularly good blend, I would get high aspirations of starting my own tea venture. But that is a failure for another day.
But you,
I asked,
you still love her, don't you?
I was a little afraid of her answer. This was my Aquilo mom. To this day, I have difficulty thinking that her love might not be unconditional and all-enduring. If my own mother turned her back on me with as much unwavering conviction, it'd be like watching the pyramids melt into dust.
Girl, there's an Ariella that I will always adore with every cell of this old body of mine. I couldn't stop if I wanted, and I would do anything to get that child back. But some miracles even Aquilo won't provide.
In Aquilo? At that point, I'd already fought with demons and shared conversations with angels. I'd met witches and practiced a touch of gastronomical necromancy. Olivia was privy to all of this. This town is a lot of things, scary things, but it's also a place of miracles.
Wow, I didn't think there was anything in this world to make Olivia Fig back down. Is this the part where your meddling touches my cold heart? She asked, putting the tea between us. I ain't gonna run off to that circus of hers and beg for reconciliation, if that's how you think this is gonna play out. Too much Dufour meddling?
I sipped from the tea, enjoying the tingle on my scalded lips. Olivia was right. This sort of minding of other people's business was exactly what got me entangled in situations best left alone. Then again, wasn't it also how I put myself in a place where I can help? And wasn't that the crux of my situation that fall? Walking that tightrope between meddling and assisting.
I'm sorry. You're right. None of this is any of my business. I just feel sort of invested, like we're related. Do you now?
I should have seen the warning signs. Olivia's eyes narrowed to slits, forcing her focus in an effort to see through me, the same way I squint watching bread in the oven, as if I could pierce the crust with my gaze.
Well, you did make Doris her godmother.
Olivia's jaw made a small adjustment, something very subtle, shifting ever so slightly to the right as her teeth slid together. The rest of her face remained the same, only hardening in place like candy cooling.
Who told you that? She did.
My fingers were burning from the heat of the cup, but I was too frozen in place to let go, afraid of what any sudden move might cause Olivia to do.
She came to the Aquilo last night.
Olivia is a short woman, but not a small one. When she moves, the force of her body and personality shifts the air. Jumping to her feet to slam the table with her hand was far more than a dramatic gesture. It was a cataclysmic proclamation, one that spilled her tea, sending her cup to roll on its side close to the edge.
You let her in the Aquilo? Yes. Listen to me carefully, child.
Olivia, a woman who'd once casually talked of the hunger demon as if it was an inconvenient risk, looks mortified at the prospect that I might have interacted with her own daughter.
You stay away from that girl, you hear?
I heard, but was too stunned to react. I couldn't even nod. This woman, clad in jeans and a faded t-shirt, her name and logo screen printed on the front, was not the Olivia I knew. The sly remarks and coy life advice were gone, replaced by an ironclad threat. Her cup finished its slow journey, teetering for a moment, then falling off the edge of the table in a crash.
The hell's going on in here?
As hard as it might be to believe, I was glad to see Henry Figg at the kitchen door. He was not, nor has he ever been, what one might call a voice of reason. Henry is a quiet man, equipped with but a single mood. While his grumpy demeanor might not be great for dinner parties, it's always a reliable benchmark. He's a staple, like bread, neither sweet nor savory, and great to have when things get too spicy.
Ariella's in town,
Olivia explains, her eyes still waiting for my answer.
Brought her whole damn circus with her.
Henry let out a long, exasperated sigh, the same I would release when throwing out a collapsed soufflé or pouring a delicious soup that had gone bad down the drain. He scratched at his neck, like a man unsure what thought he should have.
What do you want me to do about it? Same thing I want from this one.
Olivia meant me.
Stay out of it.
Henry Figg ran his eyes over the scene, barely bothering to notice me. Instead, he seemed far more focused on the shattered teacup, its remains strewn across the floor in a puddle of sweet tea.
Who's going to pick up this mess?
He asked, his mood even despite obvious strain.
Stay out of it,
Olivia repeated. The mood was quiet after that. I helped Olivia pick up the broken cup, and she packed my things up for my walk home. It didn't escape my attention that Henry's truck had already pulled out of the driveway by the time I stepped out. The journey home was no more pleasant than the walks to Figg's orchard had been. The weight of meats and vegetables pulled on my shoulder, giving an aching manifestation to the spiritual burden I carried. What could Ariella have done to make her parents resent her so much? All the while, those tickets for the infinite carousel burned in my mind. Oddly proportioned things they were, wide, of course, but longer than concert tickets usually were. Printed on thick card paper, they made their presence felt no matter if folded or sticking out of one's pocket. While chopping meat, the tickets called. As I caramelized onions, the tickets begged. Even once every ingredient had been sautéed, seasoned, and spiced, the tickets murmured. By the time the crock-pot ran hot, filling my apartment with the wonderful aroma of stroganoff, I was already picking out what to wear. If the Pickering farm is on one side of Aquilow's village, the fair had set up at the exact opposite. They'd commandeered a stretch of land from the Bellevaux cornfields, using the rows as makeshift roads that led from one attraction to the next. Bellevaux probably made a pretty penny renting the field, but also from the extra traffic to his Halloween corn maze. There wasn't as much of a crowd as I expected, nor was the place empty. I'd have thought an attraction decades absent would have tickled the nostalgia of the people in Aquilo, but aside from the perhaps 24 attendants, the place remained somewhat empty. Not that the number of attractions could have accommodated much more. A small section of land had been cordoned off for games. Dartboards, fishing for rubber duckies, and a bobbing for apples game sporting a logo suspiciously similar to Figg's Orchards, sitting opposite a pair of trucks selling typical fair food. I made a note to get a funnel cake on the way out, as a treat. Walking between these two sections, one could approach the big top, though it wasn't quite that big. A one-ring circus, at best, the erected structure was illuminated from within, making the wide white and blue stripes of its canvas hard to notice. Behind it all, like a halo of uneven colors and light, a modest Ferris wheel rose to the heavens, a carnival challenge to the stoic cloud of the local Pilvist cult. Funny, I remember thinking, how there was no actual carousel. The tent's interior smelled of dry hay, salt, and sugar. The fabric that kept us from the elements, these walls separating the show from the rest of reality, were sponges for odors and housed the memory of hundreds of shows worth of sweat, awe, and snacks. I found a seat a little to the back, conscious to keep myself from being noticed. The ticket said 8 in the evening, and it was already 7 minutes past that time, though the dirt ring around the tent pole remained empty. Looking around, I spotted a few of my regulars to the Aquillow, though I was quick to avoid eye contact. The weeks since closing the cafe had made the questions of why and when I would open again as frequent as they were uncomfortable. I could hear the subtle pressure in their voice, and that sharp emphasis on the question mark, a razor blade hidden in a sweet tart. Thankfully, the lights went dim and the crowd grew quiet before anyone could notice me. A loud click, and the blinding circle of a spotlight ignited the ring, and with it, out of nowhere, materialized the magnetic figure of Ariella Fig. Clad in knee-high faux leather boots over tan tights accented with a washed-out red line up the side, she stood firm and proud. The short leather jacket remained, but her braided hair was hidden under a playfully small top hat. She looked like a modest punk ringmaster.
"Welcome, one and all,"
she announced, a smile of genuine bliss pushing her round cheeks up on her face.
"What can I say? It's been too long."
Striding over the dirt with steps graceful and confident, Ariella moved around the ring, making it hers.
"So many familiar faces,"
she said fondly.
"And some no longer familiar, but far happier, I see."
She stopped in front of Patrick, one of my regulars. While Ariella clearly knew him, enough to point and wink, he seemed puzzled by the young woman.
"We've been away for too many years, but we did not sit idle during our absence. Of course, we bring back some old favorites, but we've picked up some fresh blood, too. In fact, I'm sure you'd all much prefer to sample some of these wonderments than listen to this old fool."
The crowd clapped as hard as its modest size allowed, signifying their agreement. There was little doubt that the spectators had gone from tremulous anticipation to confused puzzlement with the arrival of Ariella. But the show went on.
"Without further ado, let me introduce you to Giselle and her pet Rainbow."
The spotlight went off of Ariella, reappearing at the back of the tent to highlight a girl in her late teens. Thin of face and serious of demeanor, she wore a tuxedo of the most boring gray. Short hair the color of sun-bleached bark framed a face awash with stage fright. As monochrome as Giselle was, upon her shoulder sat a veritable explosion of colors. A massive macaw stretched its wings, twisting its neck to watch the crowd. With but a nod of her chin, Giselle gave a command, and Rainbow flew. When he came back from the shadows, it was to drop Ariella's hat atop its owner's head. Giselle whispered a shy thanks, adjusted the hat, and finally allowed a smile of her own. Lights came up in the tent, for the spot couldn't be expected to keep up with Rainbow, and the show began. Giselle would walk around the ring, giving subtle, wordless commands for her bird to execute. Rainbow would fly around, steal popcorn, play hide-and-seek, or walk the tightrope. The bird even played dead after Giselle shot it with finger guns, plummeting to the ground only to stop its fall at the very last moment. Once done, but before she could make her exit, an immense ogre of a man strode out. Twice Giselle's height, made of nothing but glistening muscles and confidence, this specimen was the very picture of a carnival strongman, down to the bald head and handlebar mustache. As Giselle bent down in a deep bow, along with Rainbow, the mountain of strength did so as well, plucking the hat off the girl to put on his own head. And so his act began.
"Incredible,"
someone next to me said.
"Isn't it?"
It was Madeline Payne, the wife of Dr. Ilias Payne, but most importantly, the mother of the late Clara Payne. Not a woman I saw often, she seemed to be doing a little better every time we did meet. Never too far from the shadow of her grief, it was nice to see her at a public event, properly awed by the display.
"It is quite the performance for such a small production." "Oh, of course,"
Madeline agreed.
"But I'm talking about Ariella. You know, she used to babysit me."
It took a moment for me to find her, but when I did lay eyes on Ariella again, she stood by the ringside, supervising the passing of her hat again. This time it went to a pair of clowns, one dressed in bright green and the other in sanguine red. They fought for the hat, making the accessory a part of their slapstick act.
You mean that you babysat her?
No, Madeline reaffirmed.
Not that she was that much older than me, but that woman would set my curfew when I was 10 or 11. Now look at her.
Leaning in, I obeyed. Madeline was right. The sight was incredible.
She hasn't aged a day since the time she left,
Madeline added for emphasis. The rest of the show went on without my notice. Instead of watching acrobats and knife throwers, I struggled to keep track of Ariella as she moved from in and out of the light. Every time the act would change, she would adjust her position, out of the way but close by. The behavior reminded me of Olivia and how she'd become my own Aquilo mom. The protective instinct runs thick in the fig veins, and that apple didn't fall far from the tree. While her skin wasn't flawless, still bearing the pockmarks of teenage acne and crow's feet inherited from her father, Ariella suffered none of the side effects of age. No sagging of her features or wrinkles on her forehead or around her mouth. Her movements were those of an athlete, not a woman that should have been in her late 40s at best. The show looked to be winding down as Ariella retrieved her hat from the old man in Victorian clothing, who'd been using it as part of an elaborate juggling act. Alone once more in the ring, the spotlight shining on her beaming face, Ariella parted her lips to speak the expected thanks before bidding us all a good evening. But a loud click brought another light to life, illuminating yet another performer. Something left the tent at that moment. Whatever slow, growing joy had been nurtured through enthusiastic and playful displays withered along with Ariella's smile. Even Madeline, who'd been quiet since her initial interruption, let out a low gasp. This newcomer, whose cold presence had soured the mood of performers and spectators alike, was like no one I'd seen at the Infinite Carousel, or even Aquilo so far. I could have gone so far as to claim there was something utterly anti-Aquilo about this person. Tall, thin, and leathery, he wore the gentle expression of a man who could smother a child without breaking his grin. By that time in my life, I'd flirted with death and sat next to demons and angels, yet I'd never seen a creature with such malevolent predatory poise. From the way his feet hit the ground to the sweeping of his eyes over the thin crowd, he exuded a malicious detachment to all around. Except for Ariella.
Ah,
the thin man, wearing a proper, if tattered, ringmaster outfit, exulted.
What a night, isn't it? So much talent and so many generous patrons. Certainly lines up to my withered old memories of this place. Ah, yes, Aquilo.
As the name of the city escaped his thin lips, this man grabbed at his chest with long fingers, his hand like a dying spider. He looked as if he was trying to tear his own heart out.
But could we call the show over without its one final act?
Vincent, no, Ariella begged. Please. Her own fingers had decrowned her head, removing the hat to crush it between nervous hands.
My dear, this Vincent said, the show must go on.
He then snapped his fingers, making a quiet, dusty sound, but at his command, a ring of fire ignited above.
You would lay claim to the Infinite Carousel?
This new ringmaster said, threat laid bare between his words.
Earn your name on this ship's pennant.
Absolute terror welled up instead of tears in Ariella's eyes. Through a defiant shaking of her head, she stood, her back straight and rebellious. She even set the hat back on her head, though a little crooked.
No, I will not. You said I could be ringmaster, and I was done with this act. I have earned this.
The spotlight caught Vincent's eyes in such a way to make them glow for a moment, and during that split second, his entire face transformed. There was no longer a mask of waxy pride covering the raw intensity of the man. The beast was laid bare under the fire of anger at his petulance.
You will.
The words swept over the tent like a gust of wind. The power of his command so adamant that I nearly went up the tent pole to perform the act myself. Whatever hold these words had on strangers yards away, they were ironclad upon Ariella. Without a retort of her own, the Fig Girl took off and dropped her jacket to the ground. She adjusted her hat one last time before stepping to the tent pole. Complete silence fell on the tent, and the ring was soon lined with every performer who had danced, juggled, and pranced through it before. All looked up at Ariella as she unhooked a set of trapeze from the rigging near the tent's roof. An automaton moving against her will, she did everything with mechanical efficiency. Gone was all the showmanship and joy of her previous stage presence. She was a reluctant executioner sharpening an axe before putting her own head on the block. Once everything was prepared, the burning ring aflame for the entire length of time, Ariella peeled off her boots and licked wolf teeth in her mouth. Even from such a height, I could see that there was not a drop of sweat on her brow, only fear and frustration. The act was a simple one. A short and rather uneventful trapeze act that lacked not in skill but rather flair. Where every other artist had performed with a spring in their step and an open mischief in their act, Ariella was going through the motions. Swing a few times, somersault once, go through the flaming circle, back and forth. It was done almost before it began. 2 minutes at most, leaving the performer to sit, dejected and defeated, at the top of the pole, watching the fire. A single sound broke the otherwise impenetrable silence. The dry clap from the ringmaster, Vincent. He clapped slow and loud for an interminable period.
"Bravo,"
he said, satisfied if not happy or impressed.
"What a finale! Don't you agree, my friends?"
No one replied.
"Thank you all so much for coming. Don't forget to ride the Ferris wheel before leaving, and do try one of our games. You never know when fortune might be smiling upon you."
Each word came out rehearsed and used, having surely been repeated hundreds of times before they lost every sense of meaning to Vincent. "Get out of my tent" would have been just as efficient a way to clear the bleachers. And we did, though none walked out without casting a glance back to Ariella atop her perch, and the performers gathering beneath her like a living safety net, ready to catch her fall. What a sight it would have been to witness Aquilo from atop the Ferris wheel. I could have imagined myself trying to spot all the landmarks that define the small town to me. The cafe, Helen Edna's notary office, even Pearls of Wisdom would have been interesting to see from a height. Perhaps I could have seen Fig's orchard on the horizon, though the night would have surely cloaked Olivia and Henry's home from sight. Instead, I wandered through the fairgrounds, watching almost every single patron depart. A handful did as instructed, meandering towards the games or gathering in front of the food trucks to grab something for the way home. The mood had lost all of its festive effervescence. The exodus felt more like a funeral procession. We were a quiet family leaving the bedside of a sick family member, all thinking the same thing, but none too eager to bring it up. On hearing Vincent's command, I'd lost my appetite for funnel cake. All I wanted was to go home to my raccoons and forget the whole evening had even happened. But, as Olivia has pointed out, both as a tease and accusation, I'm a meddler from a family of meddlers. And while her parents' attitude puzzled me, her employer's treatment of Ariella angered me more so. I couldn't imagine myself finding and barging into the trailer of this Vincent fellow. Not only was it not something I felt comfortable doing without knowing all the facts, if I had to be completely honest, the man terrified me. I'd seen but one episode of him, and I understood Ariella's reluctance to disobey. Instead, I wandered the fair, drinking in more details of the attractions and waiting to run into one of the performers who'd visited the cafe. Or, with some luck, find Ariella herself. Resisting the urge to throw some darts in the hopes of winning a plush raccoon, I weaved between the games, getting close to the edge of the corn. Like a wall of dead vegetation, hundreds of stalks barred anyone from wandering away from the attractions. This should have been it, my signal to turn around and find another distraction to pass the time, but something caught my eye. Like a Christmas tree caught in a bird cage, I saw the Ferris wheel broken into hundreds of tiny versions of itself, reflections picking up on the colorful display of lights and movement, calling out for me to get closer. House of Mirrors, the sign said. Large serifed lettering of blue and white, swallowed whole by the darkness. Only the vague caress of the moon and tickle of light bulbs from the rest of the fair made it visible at all. Lost in thought, I stepped ever closer to the ramshackle structure. Upon cursory inspection, the safe assumption would have been that the attraction was currently closed, but once in sufficient proximity, I could see cracks of soft fluorescent light from within. A store-bought sign, faded by sun and rain, read, "Open." There was nothing inviting about the House of Mirrors at the Infinite Carousel, apart from its isolation and abandonment. I was seeking my own counsel as I figured out what to do about Ariella and the display I'd been witness to. What better place to be alone with myself? Plywood floors creaked under my footsteps, loud in the quiet interior of the house. The first turn was nothing too interesting. More plywood lined the walls, painted over with more large letters warning that the version of me that goes in might not be the one that comes out. Platitudes implying that my reflection might trap me in the mirror and take my place. On turning the second corner, the House of Mirrors took its name with ambition, refusing to abandon the fear factor in the process. This wasn't the modern House of Mirrors I'd seen in fairs and carnivals in Montreal. Far from a polished experience of uniform reflective surfaces, some twisted and bent to warp images, each mirror in the house seemed to have its own story to tell. Still held firm by their original frames, they were all different, representing a plethora of past decades. Most were from perhaps the 50s, 60s, or 70s, but many were far older. So ancient were a number of specimens that the glass had become stained and speckled. An antiquarian would have had a field day in here. Even I, with only a passing fascination with the topic, was pulled in so deep that before I realized, I had wandered far into the House of Mirrors. So far, in fact, that I would have been hard-pressed to tell from which direction I had come. Miriam's to my right, Miriam's to my left, I was surrounded by infinite versions of myself. Each image of my face reflected the same annoyed expression. The weak and occasionally flickering fluorescent tubes doing a poor job of helping me find my way out. "Great," I whispered, half hoping that one of the Miriams would step up and offer guidance. Nothing. I kept turning around, looking over my shoulder, squinting at each eclectic mirror frame, trying my best to remember if one was distinctive enough or sparked a memory of my getting to this place. Nothing. Then my stomach growled. "Shut up," I told my guts, regretting not getting that funnel cake after all. That's when the hallucinations started. First, it was the rustling of clothes. Then it was the echo of footsteps. Eventually, the whole light itself seemed to flash and stutter, breaking the images that surrounded me. The Miriams no longer appeared to look whatever direction reflected my own stare. They were all looking at me, a fact difficult to notice but obvious once seen. Then, a few began to change. The first I noticed was clad in white, a Miriam that wasn't me. Taller and with longer hair, she looked wild, wrapped in white linens that could have been a wedding dress or a funeral shroud. She held a sickle in one hand and a handful of wild garlic in the other. A second, standing to her right, was taller still and had wild red hair. Face round and smiling, there was a mischief reflected in each of her perfect white teeth. Her clothes were the least feminine of them all, trousers and a deerskin coat. The only part of this woman that was undeniably connected to me were the eyes. They were my eyes, down to the shy aversion to visual contact. The third warped reflection was of a short woman, a little older than most, but wiser and more capable than the rest. She looked like a proper New England pilgrim, or how I imagine one to dress. Her hair, faded and curled, was meticulously held in a modest bonnet. She held a broom like a soldier might hold a spear, and looked just as ready to strike with it. A fourth woman most closely resembled me. The same hair, the same face, down to the pouty lips she bit too often. Even her accessories were a call back to my own fascination and obsession. A pan in one hand and a butcher's knife in the other. She looked wounded, but still a covered pot of simmering potential. The sixth mirror. The sixth mirror reflected someone familiar without being familiar. An old woman in tight jeans with flared bottoms. She looked old but bright and alive. Her hair was a grayer version of my own, and her eyes held a softness that reached from beyond the mirror's surface. While every reflection was content to stare at me, the woman in the sixth mirror held out her hand. Unwise of me, some might say, but I stepped closer to this woman, allowing the image to reach out with her wrinkled fingers. I could see the burn scars from opening a scalding oven on her wrists. Her apron was stained with oil and tomato juice. Underneath the signature of 1,000 meals prepared, I could see the familiar icon of the Aquilo Cafe. "Doris?" I asked, allowing her palm to cup my cheek. This strange, imagined meeting was cut short as the hallucinations turned angry. The fifth mirror, the one who, a moment ago, had been empty, was suddenly filled with a presence. Another witch that resembled none of the others, apart from shards here and there. Her hair was long and white, with dark eyes that pierced the barrier of the glass that separated us. Her skin was tight and sun-beaten. She wore what might have passed for dirty pilvist robes, covered in twigs and grass stains. Her hands, the gnarled fingers of an angry crone, held nothing, clutching instead at the ancient frame of her mirror. "My spoon!" she snarled, spittle hissing between her teeth. "Give it to me!" Her hand reached out and impossibly grabbed my wrist. In my horror, I looked at the terrible woman, seeing for the first time the multitude of braids in her thin hair and the etched sigils on her skin. Most of all, I noticed the faded blue light that burned cold at the back of her pupils. I was about to scream and scramble, lash out for my freedom and perhaps for my life, when a third and final voice called out, "Miriam?" Ariella. She must have been close, for her footsteps crept down the corridor before she could turn the corner. When I turned to look, she rounded the bend, and with her arrival, my image was restored. Unwarped and untainted by the echoes of the past, I was once again only in the company of dozens upon dozens of Miriams. And one Ariella Fig. "Are you okay?" The daughter of Olivia Fig didn't walk between the mirrors, but rather sauntered and danced. She moved like someone trying to avoid the walls, either as part of a game or something more dangerous. "I'm fine," I answered, looking around, something still bothering me. "Just managed to spook myself with all these mirrors." "Yeah." She tilted her eyes, holding my gaze with a forced smile. "I don't think we're supposed to see ourselves so many times for very long. Messes with the mind." Her index finger found my forehead, poking me between the eyes to make her point. "What about you? Are you okay?" Before answering, Ariella inhaled deeply to blow a strand of hair from her face. She crossed her legs at the knees and, with measured grace, let herself fall to a sitting position on the floor. I followed suit, though not with as much fluidity. All the other Miriams did as I did, crouching carefully to sit on their heels before letting themselves drop. Something was definitely not right. Everything I did was echoed by a chorus of myself. Only while hallucinating the strange women did my reflections abandon me. But Ariella was alone. a reflection of how unique she seemed compared to me at the time. There was only one of her, while I was followed by an army of myself. "I'm fine," she said, careful to follow my gaze and gauge my understanding. "Just not a fan of fire." "Everyone's afraid of fire," I offered as a test. "Most people are 70% water. Sure, the burn hurts as it sears the skin, but truth is, these rings of fire are mostly harmless. That's part of the illusion. But you're not most people." She shook her head, tilting it again, but to the other side. "I burn like paper and catch fire as if I was made of petrol." Either to make a show of it or remembering her stunt from earlier, Ariella licked her teeth again, showing off canines long and sharp enough to be fangs. "I was told that there were no vampires in Willow," I said, surprising even myself with how calm and steady I spoke. Fangs still bare, Ariella leaned in, like she did back at the cafe. She wore the expression I imagine I have when I smell a fresh batch of brioche right out of the oven. Appetite sharp, despite no design on eating. "That's 'cause my father killed them all. Well, he killed most and drove the last few out." "He spared you?" She laughed without mirth, the hilarity of the wounded who would rather laugh than cry. "Oh, no," she said. "He'd have killed me if he could have put a hand on me. I'm just real wily. Also, there's power in being proper terrified." Ouch. How strange that I had very little thought for my own safety. It felt obvious that I had been lured here somehow, that I was the target of some sort. Yet I couldn't worry about the threat of being taken for my blood, not while feeling such pity for the predator before me. What I don't get is why. Henry's usually so chill, and you seem very nice and not homicidal at all. At that word, nice, Ariella turned away from me, only looking from the corner of her eye and with a devilish smile. "You can be chill about a lot of things, and then, surprise!" She mimicked fireworks with her fingers. "You're not chill about that one thing at all. That's how this sort of thing works. And none of this was a coincidence. Dad took away all of Vincent's children. It only makes sense that Vincent would do the same to him." It did make sense. As far as ironic revenge went, that was a classic. Turn the thing Henry loved most into the very thing he hunted. How do you even begin to get over that? "That's not fair," I said, my outrage quiet but sincere. "You had no say in it. I can't imagine the Henry Fig I know ignoring that fact." Ariella didn't immediately react, lost instead in her own thoughts. She watched me as one does the headstone of an old friend, nostalgic and sad. "How well do you know my dad, though? And how can you tell if I had no hand in my own fate? The line between love and control gets a little blurry sometimes. You think you're getting a diamond necklace when in fact you're strapping on a leash." To this day, I wonder if she was referring to her parents, Vincent, or both. I remember looking for the answer in my own eyes, staring at myself to my right, my left, and behind Ariella. Dozens of Miriams, and yet none wiser than I, leaving me without answers. "The mirrors make you nervous?" Ariella asked. "I saw things in them," I confessed. "Not scary things, not at first." "A lot of people do. That's why we don't open the attraction to most people, especially not in a place like Willow. You know, I collected these mirrors myself. There are 112, all silver-backed, some over a century old. Imagine that, going to antique shops to buy mirrors when you don't have a reflection." What a strange hobby, and what a risky way to use such priceless pieces. It wouldn't take much for someone to recognize the value in a particularly old mirror and steal it one day. "Want to know a secret?" she asked, getting up in a motion as smooth as when she sat. "Might as well," I answered, accepting the hand she offered to help me up. "Seems like the night is full of them."
Oh, you have no idea, Ariella winked. But this one's a big one. I don't even know if anyone else knows it yet. The mirrors, whatever it is that makes my reflection go missing in them, it also blocks Vincent's thoughts. One mirror doesn't do it, of course. Sound can go around a single wall. But build a whole house out of them, and it's like I stop existing. I come here a lot so I can have my own thoughts and ponder how I can be free of him. Like I used to hide in the apple shed to get away from my dad as a kid. Just so I could get some quiet time and be myself a little.
Quiet didn't begin to describe the inside of the House of Mirrors. Nothing of the exterior could be heard within, and with so little light, I felt quite alone. Even with Ariella holding my hand. The absence of her image amongst the never-ending reflections added to the effect. After a while talking, she became almost a voice in my head.
Is that why you came to Aquillow? Were you looking for Doris's help?
She kept smiling at me in that neutral way. I couldn't find malice or joy. At best, I'd have diagnosed her as satisfied.
I'm no Doris,
I explained, turning from the mirrors to face my friend's daughter.
That's been made clear to me a lot lately. But maybe I can help anyways. I've figured out a lot since getting here. Not to brag, but I've managed to save others that were far more damned. Everyone has their own idea of what it means to save me, she explained, nudging me to follow her out of the mirror maze. Most with the best of intentions, but I've got my own idea of what I want out of this mess, and you'll be happy to know there's a role for you. Fangs aside, her smile was warm enough to hook me. Meddler, was I? Well, if it meant that I could help a friend I never knew I had, a pseudo-sister, if you will, then I was happy to meddle. Whatever you need, I said, giving one last look to the interior of the House of Mirrors. Let me know, and I'll do it. Oh, you're already doing what you need to do. You're bait. Darkness greeted us as we stepped out. I could see the black-on-black shape of the cornstalks. The faint light of the fair also filtered between trucks and booths, the Ferris wheel looking down on the whole thing. Everything else was obliterated by shadows. What was I supposed to do? Run for it and get lost in the fields before Ariella caught up to me? You? Ariella asked, only half surprised. Whatever powers her condition granted, it included a much keener sight than mine. Olivia's voice, still full of sass, broke through the night. Would you rather I get your father instead? Oh, he'll be here in time, Ariella explained. Can't keep the old man out of the fight. Olivia stepped closer, her skin touched by some of the light escaping the House of Mirrors. You should have stayed away, Ari. Dear old Olivia. My Aquillow mother was just as I remembered her from that first night we met. Coffee with 2 sugars, she asked, and always with her did she have that giant purse. I'd stolen that affectation over the years, fully embracing the convenience of that massive bag on my shoulder. Tonight was no different. As her daughter closed the distance between them, one delicate step at a time, Olivia dug through her purse to pull out a simple plastic container, an old orange opaque thing with a tan cover. It had stood the test of time and might have been old enough to predate her daughter's departure. Mom, Ariella said, what are you doing? Stubborn child, I'm trying to save you. With what? Leftovers? I don't need to eat, don't you know that? You'll eat this. Olivia popped the container open, allowing the lid to fall to the ground. The strong smell of apples and cinnamon filled the chill autumn air, beating out even the heavy aroma of fried dough. Traces of brown sugar and clove confirmed that this was some of Olivia's apple crumble. I could imagine that perhaps it had been a favorite dish of Ariella as a child. Perhaps the smell would bring back memories of a happier time between mother and daughter. This was, after all, one of the simpler magics of food, the connection it wove between us. Who do you think you are?
Ariella asked, amused and offended both.
Doris couldn't figure it out, and you think you can outdo her? That's delusional, Mom.
But Olivia wouldn't be turned away. Confident as only she can be, the woman stepped up to her daughter. Undeterred by the fangs, the attitude, and the faint glow of burning eyes, she pushed the bowl of caramelized apples right under Ariella's nose.
Doris didn't have all the ingredients. And you do?
Ariella seemed more surprised and revolted than curious. With 2 steps, light as a feather, she backed away from the dish. It might as well have been crepe Suzette about to burst into flambe the way she looked at the plastic container.
Oh my God. You did it, didn't you? There's nothing I wouldn't do for my own daughter. Now eat. You don't have much time.
Something in Ariella's plan had gone wrong. Or, if not wrong, there was a wrinkle. The apple dish, or rather the secret ingredient, wasn't something she'd expected. It threw salt into her pudding. Maybe not ruining everything, but certainly altering the process.
Are you insane? Doris would never have... Doris is dead,
Olivia cut in, brusque and rude in a way I'd seldom seen.
We're running out of time. I'm not putting that in my mouth.
Ariella was adamant. I wanted to interrupt, to attempt and diffuse the situation and perhaps ask about the secret ingredient, but I was already invading enough by bearing witness to this scene, my meddling having become too tight a garment to wear comfortably.
Don't be so immature, child. Pinch your nose if you have to, but eat or you'll never get better.
Ariella laughed, loud and diabolical. She reminded me of Gulliver, the way her white teeth gleamed and how she bared her throat, laughing for the heavens more than the audience.
3 decades, and you still don't get it,
she explained, frustrated.
There is no better. This is who I am, and I have no regrets or plans to change. Take it or leave it, this is your daughter now.
She bowed, and for the first time I noticed that she was no longer touching the ground, the final evolution of her feather-light steps transcending gravity itself.
If you don't eat this,
Olivia insisted, undeterred,
you won't survive the night. Your father...
With a wide sweep of her hand, Ariella knocked the container from Olivia's, sending sticky apple slices and crunchy buttered sugar to spill into the dirt. Olivia's own heart might as well have been thrown down. Her shoulders, eyes, and breath melted from her, and it was all she could do to stop from trying to gather the dish again.
No. What have you done, you fool of a girl? Your father... What?
Arielle interrupted again.
He's off to do what he does best? Good. Let him destroy that old monster.
There was a quiet pause, only the mechanism of the Ferris wheel daring to interrupt the moment.
Ariella,
I asked, finally gathering the courage to have my voice heard.
If Vincent dies, what happens to you? It doesn't matter,
she said, stern and devoid of the playful mischief she'd introduced herself with.
Dead or alive, this is who I chose to be. I'm sick of bowing. I've been obedient for 57 years. Tonight, one way or another, it ends. My love,
Olivia pleaded, desperate.
This was your last chance. Even if killing Vincent doesn't end you, your father will.
There are no vampires in Aquillow. Henry Figg killed them all. When the vampires returned, Henry would do it all over again. Henry had gone to kill the vampire Vincent, knowing full well it would likely destroy his daughter. Failing that, he would come after her himself. It could be that Ariella was right, that I didn't know Henry as well as I thought. I'd never been able to call the man a friend, but rather he's always been Olivia's husband. But I refused to believe he could go through this and not regret it later, or that his actions wouldn't do irreparable harm to Olivia. Meddler for an ounce, meddler for a pound. I didn't wait for anyone's permission or bother asking for advice or opinions. I did what the hot-headed and brave are expected to do in such situations. I ran. In hindsight, had Ariella wanted to stop me, I'm sure she could have. Even without whatever advantages her preternatural nature bestowed upon her, she was twice, who am I kidding, 5 times the athlete I was. She followed, I know that now, but she did so without a grain of hurry. I wove between the booths, circling the ring toss stand and sprinting in front of the funnel cake truck. I dodged the last few spectators and wandering performers, nearly trampling Giselle, only noticing her colorful bird at the last moment. There was no clue as to where Vincent would be, but this was a small fair with few places to hide. I could have run faster. I could have looked harder. There's no pretending that I was not plagued by hesitations. What would I do when I did find Ariella's master? Warn him and put Henry at risk? Stand between the two foes? In the end, it didn't matter. I arrived too late. Like a shadow cast by the fires of hell itself, the silhouette of Henry Figg was cut from the light of the big top. His usual hunch spoke more of a weary warrior than an old man struggling with arthritis. His height felt less lanky than mighty. In one hand he held a familiar sword, and in the other, hanging from its hair, the head of the ringmaster, the vampire Vincent. What had to be done had been done. The crowd, if such a small number of people can be called a crowd, had remained quiet. Out of fear, reverence, or shock, none dared do more than gather to the sides. Players from the show or residents from town, they mixed together in a homogeneous throng. "You were told never to come back here again," Henry called out, pointing his sword over my shoulder. "And since when have I been an obedient child, father dearest?" Ariella had survived, and with her she'd brought her mischief, though there was a taint of the malicious in it now. "Father," Henry growled. "I ain't no father of yours anymore." In a more compassionate world, there would have been regret or perhaps even indifference in Henry's voice. Instead, all I could hear was vitriol. The old man stepped forward, a slight limp showing in his gait, but monolithic determination kept his sword arm steady. It was a relief to hear Ariella's voice. She had not followed her maker to the grave, though she didn't sound glad for it. "Fine," she answered, her face a mask of feral anger. "Then we can settle this without sentimentality getting in the way. You think you can take me, old man?" When I first met Henry Figg, as he snored like a diesel engine on his favorite armchair, I'd have never thought him capable of fighting a cold, let alone vampires. That night, blade in hand while holding onto the head of his defeated foe, I had no doubt he would make short work of his daughter. "Shut up with the theatrics and we'll find out together." They circled each other, wooden horses turning to the music around me, a carousel for two that spun slowly towards oblivion. "Step aside, Miriam," Ariella demanded, the command strong in her words. But I did not budge. I'm just a chef, not an undead gymnast or an experienced vampire slayer. You need a 7-course meal fit for a king? Sign me up. Few rival me on that field of battle. But I don't have the footwork and stamina to dance with the likes of Henry and Ariella Figg. The effort and focus it took to remain between the two stretched the limits of my attention and reflexes. Head swiveling between two opponents, feet twisting and shifting under me to keep up with their maneuvering. Either could have tempted fate and tried to strike around me, but none dared. I was bait. Henry could ignore his daughter's passing through Aquilo, but not if she got me involved. He wouldn't risk wounding me. And Ariella? She could have ended me a dozen times over already. I had to trust that she meant it when she said we were like sisters. "Move!" Henry yelled, the limits of his patience as thin as the edge of his sword. Not only did I remain steadfast, I was soon joined by another who would not be cut down. "Hank," Olivia said, her back suddenly to mine, eyes on her husband.
Stop this nonsense. Get yourself out of my way, woman.
Henry kept at it, burning with rage.
This isn't our daughter anymore.
But even his fury was running out of fuel.
No,
Olivia agreed.
She's not. But she wasn't going to remain ours forever. We knew that. Don't feed me that garbage. She didn't drop out of school and run off to marry some bum, Olivia. She's a goddamn vampire.
I couldn't see Henry. My eyes were instead on Ariella, who had since stopped her dancing. She followed the circle of the carousel, keeping Olivia and I in front of Henry, but her whole stance had shifted. Even the mischief had returned to her, and before long, a smile.
Vampire or not, you'll have to go through me to get to her, Henry Fig, Olivia said.
A crowd had formed around us, and they let out a low gasp in unison. Mostly composed of players from the fair, none seemed outraged at Vincent's demise, and all were savoring the dramatics. Apparently, Ariella had been waiting for the winds of opinion to change in her favor. She flashed her fangs at me again, her grin in full effect, and gave me a sly wink.
Dad,
she called out, a child opening negotiations.
I'll cut you a deal. And I'll cut your— Hank!
Olivia stopped him.
Hear the girl out.
A tilt of her head and a twist of her eyebrows. I could almost hear Ariella say, "These two, am I right?"
Give me tonight and tomorrow night, she said. I'll pack up the infinite carousel and get out of town. Then you'll never see or hear from me again. I even promise never to hurt anyone.
Olivia and I parted a few feet, allowing father and daughter to look each other in the eyes as they made their final decision. I saw then what Henry Fig had become in the minutes since the altercation began. He was a shell of a man. Ariella may not have laid a fang on him, but her presence had drained every drop of his soul, leaving him a husk. Even his daughter was startled at how much the confrontation had taken out of old Henry, her features softening a little. I think that, in the end, that's what sold it for him. That brief moment of recognized humanity in each other. Not the sentimental reunion, but the acknowledgement that both couldn't do this forever. They stopped their circling, standing still for what must have felt like the first time in 3 decades. Henry's sword arm dropped until the point of the blade touched dirt. The anger finally melted from his face, his lined features turning into a portrait of defeat and loss. Deal. I sat atop the Ferris wheel, funnel cake in my hands, enjoying the cool breeze tossing my hair. Sure, the lights were fewer, and there were no sounds of the big city to cradle my ears. But as far as recreating childhood nostalgia, this was fine. Below, the crew and performers of Ariella's Infinite Carousel were busy taking the big top down, packing everything in after that one last performance in Aquillow. A bit of wind tossed my hair, and I shoved the last piece of fried dough in my mouth before tightening my scarf. It was going to be a brisk night.
I still owe you,
the young woman sitting opposite me said. Ariella sat cross-legged in the cab of the Ferris wheel, blue and red lights playfully coloring her features. She wore the same outfit as that first night we met, though her hair was let down into thick curls.
Are you kidding? Free funnel cake and a Ferris wheel ride all to myself? Makes up for all the manipulation and risk and confused terror. Don't worry about it. I told you I could be villainous.
Villainous. That word had weighed on me over the last 24 hours. Mischievous and fun, friendly and agile, daughter of Henry and Olivia Fig, Ariella was still a vampire.
You did,
I said, looking over the edge of the cab again.
How much, though? I mean, do you kill people to feed? Does it matter? I mean, what I say. If I say I haven't, would you believe me? If a villain can kill, she can certainly lie about it. Who cares if I tell you I've never killed if I could help it? What importance does that have that I promise I'll do my very best not to harm anyone else in the future?
Turning to face Ariella again, I put my purse on my lap, opening it a few inches.
Shows you at least care enough to pretend, I guess. Here.
I pull out a large plastic container. The contents, obscured by the semi-transparent walls of the covered bowl, were a dark crimson, like fresh red velvet sponge. And on top, a sealed envelope.
Pretty sure you were there when I said I don't eat food anymore, Ariella said, taking both container and envelope in her hands. The letter's from Olivia, I explained, watching her flip it between her fingers. She says to open it when you're out of town. The plastic bowl, well, you say it won't hurt anyone anymore. That's something I whipped up to give you a head start on that promise. Maybe even tempt you to keep it, if that wasn't your intention.
She popped the cover open and gave the contents a brief smell. Both her eyebrows shot up in surprise, and the gleam in her eyes told me she'd found something pleasant in that aroma, even for a vampire.
Well then,
Ariella said, putting the container aside.
I owe you even more, don't I? Are you sure there isn't something I can do for you? Immortality aside, of course.
I leaned my cheek on my fist, looking down again at the scene below. From here, I could see all of Bellevaux's corn maze and how simple it really was. Just as I'd hoped, I could see downtown Aquilo, though I had trouble figuring out where the cafe was. I could also see a familiar attraction slowly being pulled apart.
A mirror, I said. I'd like one from your house of mirrors. Are you sure? Weird things, those old mirrors.
Thinking back on what I'd seen in them, I couldn't agree more. To be honest, I wasn't sure what compelled me to want one of those things in my home, but if I was going to walk away with anything from Ariella's infinite carousel, that was it.
What's one more weird thing in Aquilo? Fair enough, she said after a chuckle. It's yours. You can pick one out when we get down.
As if on cue, the Ferris wheel jerked into action, starting the slow descent back to ground level.
What's next for you? I asked, trying to fill the silence before terra firma. New York State before the first snow, then all the way down to Texas. We usually do Florida in the summer, but I want to start heading west. Maybe even make it to California this year. You?
I hadn't given it any thought, but the answer came by itself. Still flush with adrenaline from the previous night, or simply following in Ariella's self-assured plans, I spoke with a confidence I hadn't felt in weeks.
Probably going to take a few days to pen a new menu,
I explained, as if she were a business partner.
Do a deep clean of the place and then look at reopening the cafe.
She nodded, satisfied. Her smile was again all mischief, and the squint in her eyes spoke of the same comfort she'd first felt when she waved at me, when Ariella still thought I was Doris. She leaned in, fangs close to my ear and breath on my neck, and with a voice that spoke of conspiracy, she teased.
Speaking of menus, want to know the secret to a perfect biscotti?
Aquilo is written by J.F. Dubois and narrated and produced by me, Amy Frost. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. Want to support the show? Buy us a coffee. Go to ko-fi.com/Aquilo to donate. Aquilo has a Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Aquilo for details. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under the username Aquilo.